Plato is, of course, the great giant of Western philosophy. A famous 20th century philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, once quipped that all of Western philosophy is just footnotes to Plato. This is a quip, but there's a lot of truth to this. Plato definitely set the tone and also the subject matter for Western philosophy. He was an Athenian. He was born in about 428 BC, and he studied under Socrates, who was a kind of an itinerant philosopher, thinker, and social gadfly. Plato founded the Academy, which was a very famous institution of learning that continued on many years after his death, and he died in Athens in about 347 BC. His writings cover an enormous range of topics, including aesthetics, political philosophy, epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, metaphysics, language, a variety of different things. At the center of all of his writings is the figure of Socrates. Socrates is, in Plato's writings, a fictionalized character, but he's also kind of a real character as well. Although when Socrates speaks in Plato's dialogues, you should think of Socrates' speeches as being Plato's opinion on the subject matter, whatever the subject matter happens to be that is being discussed in the dialogue. Still, the Socrates who does appear in those dialogues is espousing opinions that, depending on the date of the dialogue and the nature of the composition, probably more or less corresponded to the opinions of the real, actual, historical Socrates. So Socrates, as he appears in the last 5 dialogues, the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Meno, the Crito, and the Phaedo, is a fictionalized character, but not a heavily fictionalized character. He does appear to have held a lot of the opinions that he espouses in these dialogues. One of the last 5 dialogues, very famous one, of course, is the Euthyphro. And Socrates in the Euthyphro is going to his own trial at the court of Athens. And he's going to trial because he's being charged with 2 offenses. One is corrupting the youth, and the other is dishonoring the gods. In the Euthyphro, he encounters a young man named Euthyphro. Euthyphro is there in the courts of law as well. He's prosecuting his father for murder. It's got a backstory. Euthyphro's father had a servant. The servant killed a slave. Euthyphro's father then bound and threw the servant into a ditch while he went off to consult with the religious authorities as to what he should do. The man then died of exposure in the ditch. Euthyphro is heading to the court of law in order to prosecute his father for murder. Socrates and Euthyphro fall into a discussion of piety. Socrates is concerned and surprised by Euthyphro's prosecution of his father, and they discuss what filial piety is and more generally what piety is. These days we think of piety usually in a religious context as a religious conception of fealty or veneration of God. But in the sense in which Socrates and Euthyphro are speaking of it, it's also a kind of a duty or a reverence to for one's family, a kind of an ethical obedience, as it may be. And Socrates and Euthyphro fall into a discussion of what exactly piety is. Euthyphro proposes several definitions throughout the dialogue, and Socrates finds these inadequate for various reasons. They arrive eventually at a very famous dilemma, the Euthyphro dilemma. And stated in succinct form, it is this: is the pious made so by being loved by the gods, or do the gods love what is pious because it is pious? Once more, is the pious made so by being loved by the gods, or do the gods love what is pious because it is pious? If the first clause is the case, is the pious made so by being loved by the gods, then that which makes something pious is because the gods love it. I think it's useful perhaps to conceptualize the Euthyphro dilemma in a modern parlance I'm a monotheist, I'm a Christian, and for me, as a theist, there is also a Euthyphro dilemma. So in modern parlance, we might say, is that which is moral, or is morality made so by being loved by God, or does God love it because it is moral? Does God love what is moral because it is moral? So it's a useful, perhaps, translation of the Euthyphro to modern vernacular. Again, though, if that which is moral is made so by being loved by God, then God is the one who determines what is moral. This is divine command theory, or the divine command view of ethics. And on this view, it is God's will that determines what is moral. The second clause, does God love what is moral because it is moral, asserts that that which is moral is sort of intrinsically or inherently good. And because of what it is, God acknowledges or recognizes its morality. In Socrates' original conversation, it is again piety, which has an intrinsic nature. The Euthyphro dilemma is often posed as a problem, especially for a divine command theory of ethics, because God could, for instance, be capricious. So the objection goes, and God could say, command something that is immoral one day, and that immoral thing, being immoral, would suddenly change, and its status would become that of a moral act by virtue of God commanding it. So for instance, if God one day decided to command murder as a moral act, and say that murder is something to be commended, then it would suddenly become that, or so goes the objection at least. There are lots of responses that philosophers of religion have developed over the centuries. One frequent response is to say that God and morality are coextensive. That is, God is not the sort of an entity who would be capricious or who would suddenly prescribe the immoral as moral, altering its definition. Rather, God is the sort of being who is inherently, by nature, moral. Just as it is not in the nature of a fish to breathe out of water or a human to breathe underwater, so it is not in God's nature to be immoral. So God and morality then are coextensive on this view. There are other solutions to the Euthyphro dilemma, but it's a very frequent one. There is also in the Platonic corpus another famous dialogue of Socrates' last days, the Meno. In the Meno, Socrates and Meno are discussing an important set of topics. At the beginning of the dialogue, Meno asks Socrates whether virtue can be taught, or whether it is something that results from practice, or perhaps whether it is innate. And Socrates says we first have to know what virtue is. So the two questions then that they're looking at the beginning of the dialogue is, what is virtue, and can virtue be taught? And in the course of the dialogue, lots of different proposals are advanced. And Socrates at one point says, well, in order to understand what virtue is, we first have to understand what knowledge is, because perhaps virtue is a form of knowledge. And at a key moment in the course of the dialogue, Socrates encounters a slave boy. A slave boy is brought in, and this slave boy is very famous in the Platonic corpus because the slave boy seems to demonstrate a particular theory of knowledge. So Socrates asks the slave boy to solve a geometrical problem. And the problem is just this: construct a square that is twice the size and area of an original square. And the way you do it is by constructing, in fact, 4 squares all equal in area, and take the diagonal of each one. The diagonal of each one constitutes a square when assembled together, and that new square is equal in area to the original, to twice the size of the original square. But the slave boy is unable to answer this geometrical problem at the beginning of the dialogue. And Socrates, by a series of questions, gets him eventually to arrive at the correct answer. Now, there are several potential explanations of Socrates' interaction with the slave boy, and how it is that the slave boy came from not being able to solve the problem to being able to solve the geometrical problem. One, of course, is that Socrates asked him leading questions. It's possible but I think that in order to be charitable readers and to go along with Plato, we would need to accept Plato's interpretation of what happened. A second proposal is that the slave boy had experiences earlier in his life, and that Socrates' interactions with him helped draw those experiences out in a more systematic way. This is a proposal that I think is plausible, and I think that explains how the slave boy is able to assemble geometrical knowledge. A third explanation is the explanation that Plato arrives at, and it is that the slave boy had a pre-bodily existence. In other words, the slave boy has a soul, and his soul had a pre-bodily existence. And that pre-bodily existence involved the slave boy being in something called the realm of the forms, which is a conceptual realm in which there is extraordinary knowledge, abundance, insight, and perfection. And the slave boy then forgot the knowledge that he had in the realm of the forms when he entered into the body. And Socrates is merely by virtue of his questions drawing out the slave boy's knowledge. At any rate, the Platonic response is very famous because Plato thinks that he's proved the existence of the forms by virtue of the interactions with the slave boy. At the end of the Meno, they then return to the original dialogue and talk further about whether virtue is a form of knowledge, and if so, whether it can be taught. Ultimately, like almost all Socratic dialogues, they end kind of in a period of uncertainty. The Crito is another famous dialogue covering Socrates' last days. Crito is a friend of Socrates, and he offers Socrates an opportunity to escape Athens and to go into exile. He provides some arguments. Socrates has been unjustly convicted. He certainly was not dishonoring the gods, was not intending to corrupt the youth. So Crito thinks that Socrates should be able to escape, if possible, from Athens. Socrates is not of the same opinion. He thinks that he should not escape. He thinks that the city of Athens, in fact, has offered him, over the course of his life, an extraordinary set of educational and relational opportunities. So Socrates thinks that he owes the state for his existence, his upbringing, and his education. He thinks that the state has raised him. He thinks the state has nurtured him. And he thinks that he's entered into a kind of an agreement with the state. And that agreement is that the state will provide him with certain services, and Socrates in return will provide the state with his allegiance, certainly service during wartime or tax money when the state requires it from him. In fact, Socrates thinks that he's kind of entered into a contract with the city-state of Athens. And he thinks that the implications of this contract, even if the contract is just implicit, are substantial, so substantial that if the city of Athens asks him to die for it, he's obligated to do so. I personally think that the city of Athens has voided its part of the contract by unjustly convicting Socrates, and knowingly so. And in unjustly convicting Socrates, I think that it releases Socrates from his part of the contract. At any rate, the last dialogue of Socrates' life, the dialogue that highlights the day of his death, is the Phaedo. And in the Phaedo, we find Socrates surrounded by some of his close friends, including Simmias and Cebes. And they're worried because they think that Socrates is going to die, and this is going to be the end of things. Socrates is much less pessimistic. He's in fact quite optimistic. He thinks that he has a soul, and he thinks that his soul will go to the realm of the forms upon his death, that conceptual realm from which it came prior to its entrance into the body. And he thinks that that's actually going to be a better existence than the existence that he has in this body currently. He defines death as the separation of the soul from the body, and he argues that he has lived his life in anticipation of death and has spent much time preparing for death by resisting the temptations of the body, especially bodily desires, food, sleep, sex, etc. And Socrates seems to think that if we successfully resist these physical temptations, then our souls will be able to spring free at the time of our death. Whereas if we do not, then perhaps our souls will be unable to escape the body at the time of death. Maybe they will dissipate into nothingness. At any rate, Socrates himself does think that his soul is immortal and that he will live on after his death. He makes an argument for the soul's immortality using a cycle of opposition. Things necessarily come from their opposites, and a life and death are opposite states. So dying and coming to life must be opposite processes, and coming to life must balance dying. Therefore, things that come back, or things that die must come back to life again. So goes the reasoning here. Okay, I think that Socrates is making a category error here. I am a Christian and I believe that my soul is immortal. I believe that I am immortal as a soul-body composite. But I don't believe this for the reasons that Socrates offers in this dialogue. The category error that I think Socrates is making is I think that he is projecting upon the soul some of the characteristics of bodily things. Plato is a dualist, and I wonder here if Plato is ascribing incorrectly properties of bodies to the soul. At any rate, Socrates does offer another argument for the soul's immortality, which I will highlight here. There are some others as well in the dialogue, but I won't go into them here. The third argument for the soul's immortality that Socrates offers is based on simplicity and affinity with the forms. Okay, so the key thing here is just this idea that there are two worlds. There's this world and then there's the realm of the forms. And the human soul bears greater resemblance to the things of the realm of the forms than the things of the first world. Thus, when it has been freed of bodily influences, it will likely make its way to the second world, the realm of the forms. Okay, Socrates dies, kind of a hero, an intellectual martyr. At his death, he says, Crito, we owe a rooster to the god Asclepius. Make this offering to him and do not forget. Asclepius was the god of healing, and Socrates seems to be saying he is grateful to be healed from the body. He seems to be saying that death is a form of healing, and he seems to be grateful that he will be healed from the ills of the body and go to the realm of the forms upon his death.